Hi class. I want to talk with you in this short video about Reconstruction and racial uplift, which is the period in the decades immediately following the Civil War from about 1865 until about 1919. So let's look first of all at some historical context. I just want to go over some of this very briefly. As you might remember, the Reconstruction period is a period about rebuilding after the devastation of the Civil War. So there were some pretty big questions that Americans were contemplating, including how to rebuild from that devastation. What is the role of formerly enslaved people, as well as immigrants and Native Americans? What is the role of women? And so with these big questions, this led to tensions, all kinds of tensions, but one of the themes that you see a lot in American literature is the theme of the community versus the individual, not just in American literature, in American politics, in all kinds of places. Harper said, "We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity." That's Francis Harper, the poet that we'll talk about a little bit later, versus the idea of rugged individualism. This tension is played out in a lot of our literature, and we do see it in this period as well. Let's look particularly at the first decade or so in this period, Reconstruction. There's a lot of forward steps here. First of all, we get the Civil Rights Act of 1865, the Reconstruction Act of 1867, and all of the promises made to provide more civil rights to African Americans. We also have the Freedmen's Bureau, a bureau for formerly enslaved people who established 4,000 schools by the year 1870. So they're just doing tremendous work. So we see a lot of progress here. We see 3 amendments passed in a short time. The 13th, which outlawed slavery, the 14th, which guaranteed people equal protection under the law, and the 15th, which gave black men the right to vote in 1870. So with all of this progress, we also get a couple steps back. The book calls this time period, historians call this time period the nadir of black experience, the low point of black experience. Now, this is after slavery, right? So if we're talking about, if this is the nadir, the low point compared to slavery, then this suggests that this era was pretty bad. In 1883, the Supreme Court outlawed the Civil Rights Act that was passed in 1875. In 1895, the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court ruled that segregation was legal. So this is a lot happening in this very short period of time, a lot of upheaval. And then in the right after Reconstruction in the late 1800s into the early 1900s, we get what some historians consider a progressive period, but also decades of disappointment, as our book says. So we see continued uplift, racial uplift efforts, lots of discussion about the best way to improve conditions for Black life in America. We get W.E.B. Du Bois's idea about the talented 10th, this idea that the top 10% will help uplift the other people in the culture. In 1895, we have a pretty symbolic year. This is when Frederick Douglass dies, and this is also when Booker T. Washington gives his Atlanta exposition speech. This is the speech that is excerpted in the book that I'm having you look at this week. We see at this time increased literacy with all the educational opportunities that are increasing. There's a growing audience for Black literature among Black people. We get the Southern Depression in 1914. Sorry about the typo there. And the Boll Weevil Plague of 1915. So again, more continued upheaval into the early 1900s. And the first wave of the Great Migration to formerly enslaved people and other families in the South, Black families, heading north to cities in the North. We'll talk about that when we get to the Harlem Renaissance. Okay, so I want to talk about two of the biggest leaders during this time period. We have Booker T. Washington, who wrote Up From Slavery on the one hand, and we have W.B.E. Du Bois, who wrote The Souls of Black Folk on the other. And this week I've asked you to read a couple of really short excerpts from each man's writing. If you haven't yet had a chance to do that, you might want to pause this video and take a look so that the following little tidbits make a little more sense, so that you have a little more context for them. So let's look at what Washington said in the Atlanta Exposition Address. He is talking to white people, and he is trying to tell them about what kind of neighbors, what kind of fellow citizens Black people will be. So you can see some of the words that I've bolded. As we've proved our loyalty to you in the past, so in the future, in our humble way, we shall stand by you with a devotion, ready to lay down our lives if need be in defense of yours. Black people will be patient, faithful, law-abiding, and unresentful. So he's making white people some pretty big promises about how he thinks formerly enslaved people will feel, that they'll be loyal and devoted and humble. He talked about, he used the metaphor of a shipwreck and the people on the ship wanting water, and instead of asking their neighbors for it, they should cast down your bucket where you are. That's the advice they're given. Okay, so start from where you're located now, rather than aiming too high, is how many interpret him there. It is at the bottom of life we must begin, and not at the top. He says the masses of us are to live by the productions of our hands. As a child of laborers myself, I know the importance of living by your hands, right? And the value of manual labor and the dignity of manual labor and the beauty that can result from that. The reason that these ideas become controversial is because critics thought that Booker T. Washington was suggesting that that's really all that we can expect Black people to do, is live by the productions of their hands, do manual labor, and not too much else. He also said that rights will be accorded by Southern whites after African Americans have shown them what they've earned, right? So this idea of being patient and waiting for rights, showing your white neighbors that you are devoted and humble, and that you're starting from the bottom, and then when white people decide we're worthy, that's when our rights will come. Okay, this seems to be the message of Booker T. Washington. Du Bois and many other Black leaders were very unhappy with this message. Du Bois said, Mr. Washington represents in Negro thought the old attitude of adjustment and submission. There's another typo, I'm sorry about that. Adjustment and submission. A gospel of work and money to such an extent as apparently almost completely to overshadow the higher aims of life. And then he goes on to say, Mr. Washington's program practically accepts the alleged inferiority of the Negro races. So Du Bois is not very happy with Washington there. Now, if this, I'm going to go back here. If this sounds familiar to you, this, to me, is echoed in the Valentine meeting, the last meeting at Valentine, when Mingo is basically arguing similar things to what Washington argued. And Lander would have been more in Du Bois's camp. Something to think about. Okay, so for Du Bois, rather than being patient and devoted and humble, he said that Negroes must insist continually. By every civilized and peaceful method, we must strive for the rights which the world accords to men. And his goals were not just to work with your hands, but education, the right to vote, freedom, work, culture, liberty, and equality. So in these two documents, at least, he seems to have a much higher standard for what it is that he wants. And then he also says to be a co-worker in the kingdom of culture, to husband and use his best powers and his latent genius, as compared to working with one's hands, starting at the bottom. He strives for equality, that title of co-worker. The other thing I want you to remember about Du Bois is this idea of two-ness and the veil and double consciousness. You can pause the video and read over this passage here if you haven't already read it in the assigned excerpts. So this idea of a veil here, um, born with a veil that he's looking through, that he's covered by, um, that only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. He talks about this as a sense of double consciousness or a two-ness, an American and Negro, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others. When you are reading the poem by Dunbar, Paul Laurence Dunbar, We Wear the Mask, I want you to think about whether Dunbar is talking about the same thing or whether he's talking about something different. And then Du Bois says, there are today no truer exponents of the pure human spirit of the Declaration of Independence than the American Negroes. That's a pretty strong claim, that Black people represented the human spirit of the Declaration of Independence. When you think about that, when you read Aunt Chloe's Politics by Harper, see if you can make a connection. I see a connection. I'm curious about whether you will as well. Okay, so let's talk about the goals of the poets and fiction writers of the time. We've kind of talked about the nonfiction background with Booker T. Washington and with W.E.B. Du Bois. But now we're going to talk about those authors who were writing more creatively. The context, as I mentioned before, is increased literacy rates, which meant a growing audience, not just among white people, but among Black people, for works written by Black people, and more publishing outlets as well. So basically, the two words to associate with these literary goals are instruct and delight. These writers wanted to instruct. They wanted to teach something to their readers. They wanted to document social and political conditions. Even if it was fiction or poetry, rather than a historical document, they still wanted to make sure that they were putting in the record what it was like to be Black at this time, what the social and political conditions were. They also wanted to correct the historical record. Now, remember, we see this in slave narratives as well, how Douglas and Jacobs were working to address the stereotypes and the propaganda, the pro-slavery propaganda machine. But they also wanted to shape attitudes as they instructed. And of course, they also wanted to delight. They also wanted to entertain their audience. This is why they chose creative outlets, perhaps. They were participating in the literary trends of the time. In literary realism, the broader literary movement occurring after the Civil War, these authors almost always had a didactic purpose. They wanted to teach a lesson to their readers. So I want you to think about that when you're reading Mr. Cornelius Johnson, Office Seeker, the short story by Dunbar. If there's a lesson in this story, what might it be? So I've mentioned a couple of these authors already: Du Bois, Washington. Paul Laurence Dunbar was a short story writer and a poet, so you'll be reading that short story, Mr. Cornelius Johnson, Office Seeker, and also a couple of his poems. You will recognize a line from one of his poems. And then you're going to read a couple of poems by Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who was an amazing woman that most people today haven't heard of, unfortunately. She was the first Black woman to make a living giving speeches. She was such a good abolitionist speaker before the Civil War that one review said, "This couldn't possibly be a Black woman. This must be a white man in drag and blackface." That's how surprised they were by her public speaking skills. And that's how ingrained white supremacy and sexism was in the culture then. Her career straddled pre-Civil War and post-Civil War. She wrote fiction, she wrote poems, she gave speeches, and she was just a really astonishing leader. When white women were advocating for the right to vote, she was the one who called them out on their racism. Fascinating woman. Anyway, so you'll read a couple of poems by her, and then finally a poem that I'm assuming you know well by James Weldon Johnson. That's the reading for this week. As usual, you can email me with your questions, and I'm looking forward to seeing your discussions. I'm assuming your posts will cover Paul Laurence Dunbar, but you can also write about the poems if you'd like to. All right? If you have any questions, let me know. Have a good week.